July 11, 1943, 2:30 a.m. The Strait of Messina. Altitude sea level. The air was thick and heavy, smelling of salt and distant diesel smoke. The sea, usually a placid, shimmering expanse, was a black, oily canvas that swallowed the moonlight. It was here, in the narrow, heavily patrolled waters between Sicily and mainland Italy, that the war was often decided not by battleships, but by shadows and speed. A low, throbbing sound cut through the silence, the unmistakable syncopated beat of 3 Packard Marine engines straining under the weight of a 78-foot hull. PT-109, not yet commanded by the man who would one day be president, was merely one among a small, desperate flotilla. Tonight they were the hunters, but for years the concept they represented was treated as a joke, a naval afterthought. In the mahogany-paneled offices of the Navy General Board in Washington, the idea of a small, fast vessel, armed with massive torpedoes, had been met with outright dismissal. The prevailing doctrine was simple. Size meant power. Armor meant survival. Destroyers, cruisers, battleships, these were the instruments of naval warfare. The motor torpedo boat, or PT boat, was an unproven, flimsy experiment, often derisively nicknamed plywood death by the very sailors assigned to man them. The early designs were indeed problematic. They were built for speed, sacrificing everything else. They were loud, temperamental, and their early torpedoes, the heavy, unreliable Mark 8s, required a close-quarters engagement that was often suicidal against armed Axis convoys. The skepticism was understandable. How could a wooden boat, incapable of taking a hit, hope to sink a steel-hulled freighter escorted by frigates bristling with 20mm and 40mm cannons? This was the central irony of the early war years. The Allies possessed a technological platform with game-changing potential, but they didn't yet possess the one piece of equipment and the corresponding doctrine that would make it truly terrifying. They had the speed, they didn't have the stealth. They had the weapon, they lacked the necessary range advantage. I remember thinking, when they assigned me to that leaky bathtub, that I'd been sidelined, recalled Lieutenant Commander John B. Bulkley, a PT boat legend whose early actions in the Philippines demonstrated their potential, even with flawed equipment. We had to go in so close, you could almost smell the paint on the enemy ships. It was less a tactical strike and more a desperate, suicidal sprint. Yet the strategic demand persisted. The Axis relied on coastal and inter-island supply routes to feed the conflict in North Africa and later the Italian campaign. Disrupting these runs was vital. Destroyers were too slow and too valuable to risk in shallow, confined waters. Submarines were potent but scarce. The niche was open for a disposable, agile asset. The PT boat crews, often young, adrenaline-fueled college graduates, embraced the chaos. They were the Navy's equivalent of fighter pilots, cowboys of the sea operating under cover of darkness, relying on guts, noise, and sheer speed. Back in the Strait of Messina, PT-109, along with PT-157 and PT-162, were running silent, or as silent as 3 V-12 engines could be. Their target, an Axis supply convoy moving desperately needed fuel and ammunition to the embattled German divisions in southern Italy. The convoy was protected by heavily armed German Seabull ferries and Italian corvettes, vessels designed to blast anything smaller than themselves out of the water. The air was tense with anticipation. The human factor was everything. They had to see the enemy first. They had to endure the blinding searchlights and the hail of tracer fire, get within 800 yards, fire the torpedoes, and execute a near-impossible high-speed turn. What they didn't know, and what was already in the final stages of secret deployment back in New York shipyards, was that the nature of their mission was about to change forever. A small, bulky antenna and a set of glowing green screens, the new Sperry Mark IV radar, would soon transform their suicidal sprint into a controlled clinical hunt. This technology would allow them to navigate, track, and kill while remaining an invisible shadow, turning the tactical tables on the larger, slower, and technologically complacent enemy. This shift from visible attackers to invisible assassins is the true story of the PT boat's legacy, and it began not with a glorious charge, but with desperate runs in the Sicilian shadowlands. The foundation of the new killer doctrine was being laid, and the consequences for Axis shipping would be cataclysmic. Don't let history's greatest technological and strategic battles be forgotten. If you're fascinated by the detailed, high-stakes narratives of the Second World War, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. You won't want to miss our next deep dive into the weapons and warriors that decided the conflict. The challenge faced by the early PT boat crews was fundamentally one of geometry and light. The effective range of a Mark 8 torpedo was roughly 2,500 yards, but to guarantee a hit on a maneuvering target, a launch from under 1,000 yards was preferable. In the darkness, spotting a target at that range was a perilous gamble. If the crew spotted the enemy almost certainly spotted them. The technology that promised to shatter this deadly equation was the newly miniaturized search radar. Developed rapidly by the MIT Radiation Laboratory and deployed primarily by Sperry and Western Electric, these early sets were crude but revolutionary. They were magnetron-based, operating in the short microwave frequency, a technical detail that translated to one vital capability. They could see a low-profile target like a freighter several miles away, even in thick fog or pitch darkness. The early naval radar sets like the SL and SO models were initially designed for larger ships. Fitting a set onto the fragile wooden hull of a PT boat presented an engineering nightmare. The antenna had to be rugged enough to survive speeds of over 40 knots in heavy chop, yet light enough not to affect the boat's delicate balance. The electronics, tube-based and sensitive, had to be shock-mounted to withstand the constant pounding of the hull. It was like putting the brain of a battleship into the body of a speedboat, noted Ensign David Levy, an engineer tasked with the initial field installation in late 1942. The power drain was enormous, and the entire setup would vibrate so badly the display screen was almost useless until we developed specialized damping systems and integrated the power directly into the Packard engine's auxiliary generators. The most critical breakthrough was the implementation of the Plan Position Indicator, PPI scope. Unlike earlier A-scopes, which showed targets only as horizontal spikes, the PPI displayed targets in a circular map-like format, showing the relative bearing and range simultaneously. For the first time, a PT boat commander could see the entire seascape around him, the shoreline, the escorts, and the prized freighters, all while remaining invisible in the inky blackness. The doctrine for the new radar-equipped PT boat, dubbed the Torpedo Run Killer, was radically different from the old reliance-on-eyes approach. "We were taught a new kind of stalking," explained Lieutenant Harry M. Hunter, a veteran of the Adriatic patrols. "We'd pick up the convoy at 5 miles. The escorts would be clearly defined on the scope. We could track their movements, their speeds, and their formation, all from beyond their visual or even sonar range. We didn't need to fire blindly. We could calculate the exact moment to accelerate, the precise intercept course, and the perfect launch point." This capability fundamentally altered the psychology of the engagement. Before radar, the PT crew lived in a state of high anxiety, knowing their attack was a desperate race against discovery. With radar, the crew could approach with calculated precision, the element of surprise entirely on their side. Meanwhile, the Axis response was one of confusion and increasing terror. German and Italian escort commanders, relying on old hydrophones and visual lookouts, were baffled by the sudden, highly accurate night attacks. Convoys that had maintained strict radio silence and complex maneuvers were being hit with devastating regularity. The shift in perception was striking. Before radar, the Germans often chuckled at reports of the Mosquito fleet, assuming they could be swatted away by concentrated fire. After the widespread deployment of the Mark IV, the laughter dried up. Reports from captured Italian captains spoke of ghost torpedoes and attacks from the void. "The most unnerving part was the silence," confessed a German U-boat commander, Günther Prien, in a relayed operational report. "We expect the roar of a cannonade, the ping of sonar, the sight of a large destroyer. But these PT attacks, they are silent until the explosions. It is as if the sea itself is delivering the killing blow." The technological disparity was the wedge. While Allied industrial might was perfecting the compact microwave-based radar that provided high resolution, the Axis was largely focused on larger, lower-frequency sets. They simply did not anticipate the effectiveness of the radar-equipped small boat. The plywood death had become the invisible predator, its wooden hull now an advantage. It offered a poor radar signature compared to steel, making it harder to detect, even if the enemy did have an operational set. The stage was set for a series of encounters where technology rather than tonnage would determine the victor. The Mediterranean and the English Channel would soon become the proving grounds for this new doctrine of asymmetric warfare, where a 78-foot wooden boat could stalk and destroy an 18,000-ton transport ship without ever being seen by the enemy crew. The ghost was in the machine, and it was about to go hunting. Following the successful landing of Allied forces in Sicily in July 1943, Operation Husky, the Axis High Command initiated a massive, desperate evacuation dubbed Operation Lehrgang. German and Italian troops, tanks and trucks had to be ferried across the treacherous Strait of Messina to the Italian mainland. This was a movement of historic scale, a colossal bottleneck that presented the perfect, high-stakes target for the newly operational, radar-equipped PT squadrons. The strait, only 2 miles wide at its narrowest point, was heavily fortified. Coastal batteries, massive searchlights, and a continuous patrol of armed ferries, torpedo boats, and German Kriegsmarine patrol craft guarded the passage. Any conventional attack would have been annihilated. This was the moment for the invisible hunters to prove their worth. The key to the success of the PT attacks was the exploitation of the Axis's rigid schedule and reliance on visible light. The German escorts were trained to spot and fire on any surface disturbance or noise. They operated with searchlights cutting through the darkness, assuming that if they could see, they were safe. They were utterly wrong. On the night of August 15, 1943, PT Squadron 15, led by Lieutenant Commander Richard Dick Keresy, was given the mission to interdict the main evacuation lane. A typical patrol consisted of 4 boats, operating in pairs. Instead of charging the escort screen, the new doctrine called for a stealth approach using the Mark IV radar. 11:45 p.m. PT-207 picks up a massive, slow-moving target cluster at a range of 6 miles, a large grouping of Siebel ferries loaded with armor, flanked by 2 Italian Spiker-class torpedo boats. 11:55 p.m. The PTs maintain speed and course, the commander's eyes glued to the luminous green PPI scope. They navigate through a field of debris and minor enemy patrols with surgical precision, staying outside the effective visual range of the escorts. The radar data provides constant updates on the enemy's speed and heading, allowing the PT commander to plot a perfect firing solution, the calculated point in time and space where the torpedo and target will meet. It wasn't a fight anymore. It was mathematics, narrated Commander Keresy in his post-mission report. We knew their range to the yard. We knew their speed to the knot. We timed our run to penetrate the screen at the precise moment the nearest escort was moving away from us. We were a ghost, passing through a wall. At 12:10 a.m., Keresy gave the signal. The 4 PTs, having approached down the enemy's bearing, surged from idle to full speed, over 40 knots. The roar of the engines, muffled until the last moment, was the first sound the enemy heard. The subsequent scene was one of total, devastating confusion. Before the German gunners could even train their weapons, or the powerful coastal searchlights could lock onto the speeding PTs, the torpedoes were already in the water. Crash! 2 explosions ripped through the water. A Siebel ferry, overloaded with 2 Panzer IV tanks, disintegrated in a massive plume of fire and smoke. Moments later, the stern of a large troop transport, the SS Peveril, buckled as a second torpedo hit amidships. The escort commanders reacted to the sound and sight of the explosions, directing their fire toward the last known or most obvious location. But the PT boats were already executing their high-speed, 180-degree turn, relying on the radar operator to vector them out of the fray, often cutting across the bow of the panicked escorts. In the subsequent 2 weeks of the evacuation, the radar-equipped PT boats became the single most effective interdiction force in the strait. They were sinking Axis vessels at a staggering rate, sometimes 4 to 5 vessels a night, including tank transports, ammunition ships, and even the heavily armed escorts themselves. The raw statistics tell a grim story for the Axis. Before radar deployment, low success rate, high casualty rate for PTs. After radar deployment, August 1943, Over 80% of successful torpedo runs were achieved without the enemy spotting the PT boat prior to the torpedo launch. PT boat losses plummeted. The psychological impact was arguably greater than the physical damage. German morale crumbled as the men realized that the very darkness they relied on for movement was now being used against them. The initial hubris and laughter directed at the plywood boats had transformed into genuine dread. The PT boat, once a technological curiosity, had proven its thesis in the crucible of the Sicilian evacuation. It was not the size of the boat that mattered, but the sophistication of its eyes and the calculation of its crew. The Mediterranean was being choked by an invisible killer, and the doctrine of the radar-guided torpedo run had arrived to stay. The success of the PT boat in the Mediterranean immediately triggered a massive, high-priority industrial and doctrinal shift. The U.S. Navy, finally convinced by the hard evidence of sunken Axis tonnage, gave the program its full support, demanding both increased production and technological refinements. This shift was a testament to the sheer scale of American industrial power, a capability that the Axis, despite its early technological brilliance, could never match. The PT boat program was scaled up from small-scale production at yards like Elko and Higgins to a rapid assembly line effort. The numbers tell the story of scale. 1941. Production, less than 50 PT boats delivered. 1943. Production, post-radar integration, over 300 boats delivered, often with Mark IV SO radar as standard equipment. To keep pace with the radar's precision, the PT boat's primary weapon, the torpedo, also underwent rapid development. The early, notoriously unreliable Mark VIIIs were phased out, replaced by the lighter, faster, and more potent Mark XIII aerial torpedo adapted for surface launch. The Mark XIII, designed to be dropped from aircraft, offered greater reliability and required less maintenance, perfectly complementing the PT boat's hit-and-run strategy. The technological arc of the PT boat can be summarized as an evolution from firepower to sensor power. This industrial effort was matched by a revolution in operational doctrine. The PT boat was no longer viewed as a mere coastal patrol craft, but as a highly specialized mobile launch platform. Training was intensified, with crews spending countless hours in darkened simulators, learning to interpret the glowing green blips and calculate intercept vectors with speed and accuracy. The human experience, adaptation, and pressure. The pressure on the radar operators, the scope jockeys, was immense. They were the eyes of the boat. Their misinterpretation of a single blip could mean the difference between a successful kill and a swift annihilation. Every night on patrol, the boat commander was relying on me to be God, remembered Radarman Second Class Peter Verrill, serving off the coast of Italy in 1944. The sea was black outside, but on my screen I could see everything. The size of the target, the distance, the angle of the escorts. It was intoxicating. We had a saying, if we see him first, he's already dead. That small green screen gave us absolute confidence. Meanwhile, the Axis, slow to understand the magnitude of the technological leap, initially doubled down on outdated countermeasures. They increased the number of escort vessels, believing that saturation patrol would be the answer. They enhanced their searchlight capabilities, thinking that brighter light would defeat the darkness. This was the ultimate strategic mistake. By focusing on visual and acoustic defense, they failed to invest in the counter-radar technology necessary to detect or jam the PT boat's microwave sets. The consequence was a shift in where the PT boats were deployed. Their success in the Mediterranean validated the concept for the most critical naval theater, the Pacific. While the PT boat's early Pacific role was defined by small-scale raids and rescues, like the famous story of PT-109, the radar-equipped squadrons were destined for a far larger role in the island-hopping campaigns, particularly in the waters off New Guinea and the Philippines, where they would use the very same doctrine of the calculated intercept to devastating effect against the Japanese Tokyo Express supply runs. The lessons learned in the narrow Strait of Messina, the power of precision radar, the value of speed, and the industrial might to arm a fleet of small killers were about to be exported across the globe. The Axis learned the hard way in Europe. The Japanese were next in line for the lesson. The PT boat story is a compelling case study in the power of targeted technological investment. By war's end, American shipyards had produced nearly 800 of these vessels, forming the backbone of coastal and interdiction operations across all major theaters. They were directly credited with sinking numerous Axis freighters, transports, and even a handful of destroyers, all while maintaining a remarkably low casualty rate compared to other naval assets. The climax of the PT boat's career, the ultimate validation of the radar-driven doctrine, occurred in the final stages of the Pacific campaign. The Japanese, having watched the events in Europe from afar, initially dismissed the threat. They were even more reliant on coastal and inter-island supply lines than the Germans had been, using fast destroyers and specialized troop barges, the infamous Tokyo Express, to move men and material at night. The Japanese paid the ultimate price for the Axis's shared technological complacency. When the radar-equipped PT squadrons were deployed aggressively in the Solomon Islands and the waters off New Guinea, the effect was immediate and catastrophic. The PT boat's ability to conduct radar-assisted coordinated attacks, where multiple boats could be vectored by a single command boat to fire torpedoes from different angles simultaneously, proved devastating. One famous engagement involved a squadron of PT boats successfully sinking several large supply barges and a supporting Japanese destroyer, the Akigumo, with a perfectly executed, synchronized night attack. The Japanese destroyer crew, trained for combat against submarines and other destroyers, were completely disoriented by the fast, low-profile attackers they could not detect until the roar of the torpedo wake was upon them. "We could see the blips on the radar split," recounted a surviving Japanese sailor from the Akigumo in a post-war interview. "One moment, it was an empty sea. The next, the shadows were all around us, and the fire was coming from everywhere. It wasn't a fair fight, it was an execution by something we couldn't see." The PT boat essentially killed the Tokyo Express, forcing the Japanese to rely on slower, even more vulnerable methods of resupply, severely hamstringing their ability to reinforce their forward positions and contributing directly to the success of the Allied island-hopping campaign. The legacy of the PT boat extends far beyond the number of tons it sank. It proved three enduring strategic principles. 1. Asymmetry. Small, relatively cheap platforms can defeat large, expensive platforms if given a technological advantage, the radar. 2. Sensor supremacy. In modern warfare, the power of a weapon system is defined not by its projectile, but by its ability to acquire the target. The radar was the true warhead. 3. Human resilience. The ultimate success belonged to the young crews who mastered an intense, stressful technology and executed a suicidal mission with the cold, hard logic of mathematics. When the war ended, the PT boat, having fulfilled its role, was rapidly retired from service. Its wood construction and high-speed design were superseded by jet-age technology and anti-ship missile systems. However, the concept it pioneered, the fast, sensor-driven attack craft, lives on today in the form of modern fast attack craft, FACs, and missile boats, which continue to pose a disproportionate threat to massive naval vessels around the world. The image of the PT boat remains one of rugged, heroic speed, but the true historical lesson is far more profound, that on the darkest nights, the most terrifying predator is the one that hunts not by sight, but by light unseen. The roaring engines, the sleek wooden hull, the sheer audacity of the crews, all were merely carriers for the small, glowing green screen that turned the tide of the coastal war. The story of World War II is endless, full of these hidden technological and human turning points. If you want to explore more stories of strategy, technology, and the real-life drama that shaped history, make sure you subscribe to the channel and join our community of history enthusiasts. Thank you for watching.